Hi, good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see you here. My name is Aníbal Pérez, I'm director of the Kellogg Institute. And for everyone who is following online, I want to remind you that you can submit questions during the talk by using the box below the window where you see the lecture. It's a pleasure for me to introduce again Nusrat Chowdhury as our presenter today. She's an associate professor of anthropology at Amherst College, and her research focuses on the affective and aesthetic dimensions of post-colonial democracies, popular sovereignty, and political communication. You may recall Nusrat's presentation about the political crisis in Bangladesh just a month ago. It was super interesting, so we are delighted to have her presenting again. Her first book, Paradoxes of the Popular, is there is a spirit. Her first book, Paradoxes of the Popular, is an ethnography of the crowd in Bangladesh. And today we are lucky because she will introduce to us her new project that she has been developing as a visiting fellow at the Kellogg Institute, which is mega development as political work in the age of mass democracy. Nusrat, welcome again to our lecture series.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Oh, don't clap yet. If you're not tired of seeing me in this space, I just wanted to thank everybody. I know it's the last week of classes, and I know how exhausted most of you are. So really grateful that many of you could make it. This is also, I'm not coming back in the spring, so I also wanted to thank the Kellogg Institute for being such warm and welcoming hosts, everybody here and my fellows for being such fun. So thank you. I do want to just give a bit of a trigger warning that I do talk about a case of a violent death of a person in this. It's a short section of the piece. I've written more elaborately about it elsewhere, but I just wanted to flag it before I start. So today I present you a story about stories. Yes, it is more specifically about the longest river bridge in Bangladesh, which is at the center of my second book project, as is evident in the title that Anibal just read out. What I offer here today, however, is not so much the nuts and bolts of the project itself, pun intended, but the stories that have made the bridge at once a success and a scandal. These stories have begun circulating long before the bridge was inaugurated in 2022 by the recently ousted Prime Minister of Bangladesh amid much fanfare. They still circulate today as a changed political environment has opened a floodgate of information about the exaggerated cost of the development projects taken up by the former regime, including this particular bridge, and the cooked up data on development that justified the expenses, including foreign loans and expertise. This too is another story, a story of economic success that relied on a constant circulation of narratives of development and democracy. So let's start with the bridge. This photo, actually, I took it. It was taken while the construction was still going on. It is named after the river it traverses, the Podda. It's written in English Padma, but in Bengali it's pronounced as Podda, which is about 75 miles long and 5 miles at its widest. With a pile depth of around 400 feet, the bridge is the deepest in the world. The Podda Multipurpose Bridge Project finally opened to the public in June 2022, years after the anticipated date of completion and way over the projected cost by more than $1 billion. One of the few mighty rivers that come down from the Himalayas and flow into the Bay of Bengal, the Podda also slices the country into half, resulting in lopsided economic and social development that the bridge aims to redress. It's expected to bring Bangladesh closer to India, China, Myanmar, and Bhutan by establishing links to regional blocks and corridors for smoother access to global markets. Much hype around the bridge has revolved around the engineering feat involved in training the Podda, whose massive flow of water is believed to be second only to the Amazon. The fantastic appeal of the Podda Bridge surpasses its monumentality and its material effects. Its completion against all odds had been a campaign promise, a political trump card, and a dream project of Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina, the sovereign with the longest tenure in modern South Asia, until her dramatic exit in the summer of 2024. So Hasina has led the Awami League, the political party that claims to have ushered in independence in 1971, and until 2024 has been overseeing Bangladesh's graduation to developing status recommended by the UN Committee for Development Policy. At the time of the bridge's inauguration, the Awami League was in power for over 13 years, following 2 national elections of dubious integrity held without the participation of the main opposition party. Albeit the most prominent, the bridge is one of a number of signature mega projects undertaken by this government that has relied heavily on infrastructural development to further its populist appeal. The ways in which mega development has been pitched as a panacea to Bangladesh's economic woes during the rule of Sheikh Hasina have borne the distinctive mark of a rising authoritarianism, one that has relied singularly on its visual appeal. So this particular image exemplifies this attempt to usher in the visual politics of infrastructure in the service of the state. We watch the former prime minister watching and recording the Podda Bridge from a helicopter. Its meta-reflexivity captures the prime minister's excitement in witnessing the construction of the bridge, a witnessing in which ordinary citizens are invited to participate. In the act of watching her watching, they enjoy both an unobstructed view of the bridge, albeit framed by the window, and a view mediated through the screen, a doubling that recruits the audience in an act of seeing that ideally activates patriotic affect emanating from the sovereign herself. The Podda Bridge, whose construction has been largely lauded as a personal accomplishment of Sheikh Hasina, is here being archived in the personal phone of the former Prime Minister herself. So as the pinnacle of infrastructural achievement, the Podda Bridge also forces us to rethink infrastructure beyond what Penelope Harvey describes as the global currency of investment. With its likeness endlessly appearing on billboards, posters, advertisements, official correspondence, and national currency, in addition to its rehearsed yet relentless appearance in political speeches, the bridge was also the country's most popular tourist destination for months after its inauguration. So the paper today is about the bridge, but understanding it not simply as a structure, but as a spectacle whose social life is mediated through a number of language events. I have identified 4 genres that have been constitutive of the Podda Bridge: rumor, language of law, political rhetoric, and literary texts, including music, poetry, plays, and stories. For the purposes of brevity, today I focus on the first 2. So these are 2 very different kinds of what I call language events. What ties them together is the bridge, of course, but also the concept of hearsay, which has been important in both law and anthropology. Both are also scandals that afflicted the bridge project since before its completion. The first controversy involved the World Bank, the main donor organization that was to foot a bulk of the construction expenses. It decided to withdraw the $1.2 billion that it had promised Bangladesh since discovering a corruption scheme involving multiple countries. In 2011, the World Bank's Integrity Vice Presidency, INT, learned that a couple of employees of SNC Lavalin, a Quebec-based engineering firm, along with a Bangladeshi Canadian citizen, was planning to bribe government officials in Bangladesh to get the $50 million contract to build the bridge. The government categorically denied the charges and refused the bank's conditions for funding, which had asked for the temporary removal of a few key public officials suspected of involvement and the appointment of a special inquiry team. At the end, the bank claimed to have no choice but to withdraw. In response, Sheikh Hasina vowed to proceed without foreign funds, a much publicized act of defiance exploited to glean maximum political mileage. The second set of scandals broke out when in 2019, separate crowds in Bangladesh publicly lynched 8 people within 5 days in suspicion of kidnapping children. Groups of ordinary citizens attacked individuals near or on school campuses in different parts of the country. The mob violence was spurred by a short-lived, if highly standardized rumor that the bridge required children's heads for completion by 2020. The spate of attacks was striking in its articulation and scope, despite the fact that vigilantism against petty criminals is not uncommon in this part of the world. The violence in 2019 took place hundreds of miles from the physical site of the construction, and both women and men, to different extents, were at once perpetrators and victims. As far as one could tell, the rumor of human sacrifice died down as mysteriously as it had begun, but not before the bridge authorities were compelled to put up public signs and release official statements. This is one of the collages that circulated on social media, and release official statements raising awareness about the falsity of these claims. So before I elaborate on how and why I read these two scandals together as language events, let me offer some more background on development in Bangladesh. So it's not unusual for post-colonial dreams of arrival to be technopolitical. Progress needs concrete reminders in literal and figurative senses, and Bangladesh provides a particularly useful point of departure. Considered to be the ground zero of climate catastrophe, development in recent years has been anticipatory and adaptive, but also modernist in its core, with an overt commitment to energy infrastructure still largely dependent on fossil fuel. The adaptive policies are applied to the areas considered most vulnerable to the rise of sea level, due mostly to a steady funneling of international funds to tackle climate change. But big cities and townships remain the sites of unrelenting real estate construction, a veritable forest of speculative concrete structures. This includes a slew of mega projects under construction, far away from metropolitan life, commissioned mostly since the Awami League's return to power in 2009. So the Matarbari coal power plant and the Paira deep seaport in the Bay of Bengal, the Rampal power plant adjacent to the world's largest mangrove forest, and the Rupur nuclear power plant on the banks of the Podda seem to reflect the recent efforts by international funding agencies to close the financing gap in Asian infrastructure. In this context, Bangladesh emerges as a frontier in two very different but related senses. From a planetary perspective, because of what is largely seen as unavoidable ecological crisis, and as an emergent site of investment. The country recently got its first sovereign debt rating by the big three credit rating agencies and has been included among JP Morgan's Frontier 5 and Goldman Sachs Net 11. Despite the diminishing percentage of donor funding in the national budget, international legitimation remains vital. The World Bank incident proved especially scandalous for Bangladesh, known as an aid lab in the development world. And here I'm drawing from Naomi Hossain's book. The World Bank has been involved in the region long before Bangladesh gained independence in 1971, encouraging and implementing market-led reforms. In the 1950s, a massive hydroelectric dam in the Chittagong Hill Tracts was a result of the collaboration of the East Pakistani administrators, US State Department officials, and American corporations, particularly the World Bank. Its involvement was much more direct since the famine in 1974 that claimed more than 1.5 million lives. By 1979, the international aid flows were equivalent to 20% of the national GNP. In the shadow of the 1974 famine, as Naomi Hossain points out in her book, there was an agreement on development that came to include, one, a ruling class consensus that their own survival depended on human development and basic social protection. The agreement was to pursue a broadly pro-market, pro-poor economic and human development strategies in return for recognition and resources from the international community. So a homegrown development strategy was never an option. This created a space for NGO action for which Bangladesh is now celebrated. As Naomi Hossain further adds, Bangladesh is powerful as an aid-justifying idea, partly because its unpromising start made any success so entirely unlikely. But the idea of Bangladesh is powerful in the 21st century also because its successes satisfy both the soft-hearted liberal and the die-hard neoliberal. Bangladesh provides the photo op that assures skeptical taxpayers in the West that development works. It is a convincing case study in how moderate Islam can couple with global capitalism. So the militant Malthusianism that drove American attitudes in the 70s and 80s has faded, but there is a residual utilitarianism in development think. But this crude utilitarianism justifies the trampling of human rights and permissed fascistic tendencies, Hussein added in her 2017 book, which was published at the height of Sheikh Hasina-led development-centered regime. By 2024, a popular uprising ousted the government despite its massive investment in spectacular development, a success story that played in a loop relentlessly for a decade and a half in which the Awami League remained in power. Its claim to fame, the twin pillars of democracy and secularism, both sounded hollow against the backdrop of more stories of corruption. Of course, what circulated as stories and dismissed as conspiracy theories during the authoritarian repression has been proven to be rather accurate. So the so-called success story of development narrative itself was underwritten by cooked-up gross domestic product figures. Using a web of financial schemes, the perpetrators in the government and at some of the country's biggest companies pulled off what is now being described as the largest bank heist in the history of money. In a March 2024 interview with a regime-friendly policy publication, Whiteboard, the former prime minister laid out her development vision, and I'm quoting, "A true representative of the people has the insights to develop a country, which an elite decision maker is incapable of doing. Development is a political agenda. You cannot delink development from politics." The last sentence describes the modus operandi of her government for 15 years, though Hasina meant it in a very different way. She distanced her regime's policies from those of the out-of-touch military rulers of the 70s and 80s and asserted that politics shouldn't be about personal gains and power misuse. Still, the corruption around Hasina's mega projects and many others has long been an open secret. It was widely believed that people close to her, through politics or kinship, were pocketing hefty kickbacks from signature projects. But journalists, news outlets, and even TikTokers were penalized for questioning the cost, quality, or timeline of the projects. Podda Bridge itself came under early scrutiny, as I said, when the World Bank withdrew funds due to credible allegations of fiscal malfeasance. The Metro Rail project, too, cost more than comparable transit systems in Indonesia and India and took considerably longer to complete. So writing about these mishaps or the fact that the bridge might have taken even longer and need even more funds was risky business, as a journalist told me in 2022. Only 2 negative reports came out in his paper, and even those were too many. As I was leaving our meeting, he made sure to remind me that he was all for progress and that the child kidnapper rumors were spread to scandalize the bridge. He clearly needed to say this out loud. Furthermore, as we have recently found out, billions have been siphoned out of the country, especially to Canada and the United Arab Emirates, by loan defaulters and money launderers friendly with the regime. A recent white paper on the economy, sanctioned by the interim government, led by an economist, released staggering figures. An average of $16 billion, we are told, were illicitly siphoned off from Bangladesh every year during Sheikh Hasina's corrupt autocracy, leaving the country in a state of plunder when she fled after a popular mass uprising. In a chapter in the white paper, Mega Concerns of Mega Projects says project pitfalls such as poor planning and corruption created a vicious cycle that forced the nation to pay over 70% more for the infrastructures than initially estimated. That's 70. So by mid-2022, the economy was in serious crisis. New loans from the International Monetary Fund added to the existing burden of foreign debt, which surpassed $100 billion in late 2023. To reduce the number of non-performing loans, something the IMF had urged, the country's central bank forged the books and loosened its write-off policy. By doing so, Bangladesh Bank, which is the state bank, not only wiped out a large number of these loans, but it let the defaulters off the hook. By April 2024, the country's foreign exchange reserves had dwindled below the IMF recommended $19.3 billion. The result was a double-digit inflation. The price of daily essentials skyrocketed, exacerbating food insecurity and shortening life expectancy among the country's most vulnerable. So foreign media investigations added credence to what most Bangladeshis knew, either instinctively or through the vibrant rumor mill. All the Prime Minister's Men, a 2021 Al Jazeera expose, replete with undercover footage of high-level corruption that could be traced back to the very top of the country's political hierarchy. Two brothers featured in the documentary belong to the so-called Ahmed clan, a one-time Dhaka street gang that provided security to Hasina when she was an opposition leader. The pair fled the country after killing a political rival in the 1980s. Decades later, the brothers were rewarded for their steadfast loyalty. In 2018, the eldest, General Aziz Ahmed, became head of the military, and his younger brother received a presidential pardon. They eventually gained access to lucrative government contracts and were involved in the sale of senior government posts, including on the National Police Force. In secret recordings obtained by Al Jazeera, one Ahmed brother claimed that his work was sanctioned by the Prime Minister herself. Blithely ignoring this and many other reports, leaks, and exposés, Sheikh Hasina maintained that her government strongly opposed corruption as recently as July 2024. She publicly addressed a scandal brewing in her own household when the news of the massive corruption of one of her orderlies made headlines. And I quote her, "The man worked in my house. He was a peon. Now he owns Taka 4 billion. He can't move without a helicopter. How has he earned so much money? I took action immediately after knowing this." For most Bangladeshis, these performances of transparency and accountability were just that, performances. They meant little in a country where greed and corruption were both blatant and rampant, while most people were struggling simply to afford basic necessities. So against this backdrop, and this is just to give you a sense of how people were in many ways very aware of the extent of corruption of the regime, let me offer two examples of language events that I mentioned at the outset. Here I'm drawing on Robert Schiller's book, Narrative Economics, in which Schiller focuses on the word of mouth of contagion of ideas in the form of stories and the efforts that people make to generate new contagious stories or to make stories more contagious. These narratives, I will show, help shore up authoritarian power, but also stoke resistances to it. Robert Schiller's account of how stories help drive economic events show why and how financial panics can spread like epidemic viruses, an analogy that is often mobilized to discuss rumor itself. Schiller writes, and I quote, "Spread through the public in the form of popular stories, ideas can go viral and move markets. Whether true or false, stories like these, transmitted by word of mouth, by the news media, and increasingly by social media, drive the economy by driving our decisions about how and where to invest, how much to spend and save, and more." So my first example is one of a set of violent events that was mediated by a rumor about the bridge. In July 2019, in the northeast of the country, a young man was allegedly caught carrying a bag with a child's severed head in it. He was killed in mob beating, but the words about his culpability spread far and wide. One possible theory of the origin of the rumor comes from an opinion column and revolves around a miscommunication, a glitch in translation to be precise. And here I'm, kind of relating what the op-ed says. A Chinese engineer working on the Podda Bridge project grew frustrated with its slow progress. "We need more heads," he said, stressing the need to expand the workforce. And a half-literate Bengali worker, this is the op-ed writer, who worked on the project took it literally, mixed it with native superstition, and came to the conclusion that the bridge required human heads. The rumor circulated like wildfire, both in conversations and on social media, where the caption, "The bridge wants blood," accompanied numerous photo collages and videos. Since then, child kidnapper, the Bengali word for is chele dhara, became a dreaded figuration of threat to one's body and kin. As I said before, 8 people were killed within 5 days in July of 2019. There were others who were injured, but ultimately rescued by the police and family members. So rumor in Bangla is gujob. It carries nearly the same meaning as rumor does in English. Despite its semantic equivalence with English, gujob has taken on a heterogeneous set of resonances in the 15 or so years of Awami League rule. Gujob was what was generally known, but for one reason or another could not be easily said or said without consequence, i.e., a public secret. Any utterance that could potentially tarnish the image of the regime was either fake news or rumor, and therefore fair game for state censorship. Wary of using an authorial voice, the circulation of oppositional ideas by necessity took on the aura of unsubstantiated knowledge, their networks of circulation becoming more and more informal, thereby proximate to what Veena Das calls the region of rumor. Prolific enough as to demand its own category, bridge rumors form a subgenre of folklore within and beyond South Asia, generating a wide array of literary artifacts. In addition, ethnographers have traced similar linguistic phenomena around the sacrifice of children, women, and pregnant women, not to mention organ theft, at the service of construction projects from Brazil to Ghana, from Johannesburg to Jakarta. In Bangladesh, as a populist government acted increasingly authoritarian, any criticism marked as gujob was not simply dismissed, but criminalized. Most of these rumors were sought out on social media with revamped and repressive cybersecurity laws. Numerous writers, journalists, and activists were imprisoned and or faced torture spreading rumor. So the official efforts to tame the circulation of the bridge rumor came up with two explanatory frameworks. State officials labeled them as conspiracy. This was a smear campaign aimed at actively diminishing the accomplishment of the present government by interrupting a robust and relentless narrative of success. What better way to do this other than scandalizing the bridge, the dream project of the Prime Minister? This, given the nature of gossip itself, did not catch on. Rumor and gossip may have no author, as Laden Dolar argues, but it does not follow that they have no authority. So the incident of mob violence that I described now was propelled by a similar rumor. It caused the most stir in the Bangladeshi public sphere due partly to the victim's gender, the fact that the incident took place in the middle of the capital city, and that the victim was at least aspirationally middle class. The Taslima Begum Renu was a 40-year-old single mother of two who was seen in front of a school in Dhaka on July 21st, 2019. Renu, as she became known in public, was at the main gate of the school when a group of parents, mothers to be precise, asked her why she was there. She said she had come to get admission forms for her children. Her answer was the first cause of suspicion. Bengali medium public schools ordinarily started in January and not in July. To make sure she was telling the truth, the crowd asked for her address. At this point, Renu faltered. She first named one area, only to change her answer when asked the second time. As more suspicion ensued, the parents decided to escort her to the office of the headmistress of the school. There too, she was asked the same questions. Seeing her hesitate to speak, the headmistress gave her a piece of paper to write down her address. In the meantime, according to witness reports, 400 to 500 people gathered at the school gate. I have some drawings here that were actually taken from the case docket. The Bengali captions actually give the name of the school and the number of people and identify some of the people in the crowd by their names. One of the parents, the mother of a child in first grade, told the nearby street vendors that Renu must be a child kidnapper. So Cheledhara, the Bengali word, was used to describe a woman whose inability to speak coherently convinced others of her culpability. The crowd smashed the lock of the collapsible gate and entered the school campus. Seeing the situation getting out of hand, the school authorities used a loudspeaker to ask people to disperse, assuring them that Renu was only a parent and not a kidnapper. Oblivious to the authorial voice blaring from above, a large crowd dragged her from the headmistress's office, brought her to the open area near the school gate, and started beating her up. One of the parents was also heard egging the crowd on by calling Renu a kidnapper and putting in a few blows in her side. This was mentioned in the witness accounts and was recorded in the video footage found on the mobile phones by many people present at the site. Renu's nephew, who filed the first information report, had found about his aunt's death from a Facebook post and rushed to the hospital where he identified the body. By the time the police came and took her to the hospital, she had already died. A few details from this tragedy stand out. Taslima Begum Renu's inability to defend herself in and through language was both a source of suspicion as well as its evidence. In the FIR, her nephew mentions that his aunt has had mental health problems in the past, which may or may not have caused an impediment to her speech or her general ability to defend herself verbally that led to the violence. The police filed a case against 4,500 unnamed people who participated in the violence with the intention to murder. By September 2020, the charge sheet listed only 15. This included 2 minors and the mother of a student at the school who had initially stoked the suspicion that there was a child kidnapper in their midst. Similar patterns from the case of Renu's victimization were found in other accounts of mob attacks. A couple of days later, in a different part of the country, Josna Khatun was taking her intellectually challenged, this was reported in the newspaper, mother to the doctor when she suddenly realized that she lost the elderly woman in the crowded market area where they were waiting for a rickshaw. About half an hour of searching, she heard that a mob was beating up a woman, accusing her of being a child kidnapper. Before she could reach the spot, the police had already brought her mother to safety. There's no denying that all this became front page news because the speed at which the visual material made rounds on social media. The fact that Renu's family members found out about her death from the images circulated by those present in the crowd, a kind of viewing Rahul Mukherjee has called mobile witnessing, is tragic, but not all that surprising. But to focus only on the visual material would be to miss the point. This is why I believe what Renu was wearing on the day she visited the school premises is noteworthy. The fact that she was not visible due to the burqa, which is not just a hijab that covers the head, but an extra layer of clothing, was not a decisive factor for the crowd that gathered around her. After all, burqa-clad women are a common sight in urban Bangladesh. She was a new face, to be sure, but it was her incoherent answers that became the source of suspicion and led to her being labeled a child kidnapper. She was unable to perform the script of proper or acceptable personhood. Following Goffman's concept of interactional dysphoria, which is a sort of interactional misstep, Julia Bonhomme argues that mob violence triggered by rumors occurs when one doesn't demonstrate the interactional engagement expected of him or her. Linguistic inarticulacy, such as stammering, has historically been read as admission of guilt, as in early modern England, where incoherence in linguistic exchanges between subordinates and their superiors at the court branded the speaker, what Hilary Taylor has defined as plebeian inarticulacy. In the context of the People's Court, that is contemporary mob justice, the fates of Taslima Begum and others reveal a fecund communicative politics that connects their bodies to the Podda Bridge scandal. In mob actions driven by threat, suspicion, and accusation, one finds a short-circuiting of the 2 narratives about Bangladesh that I alluded to earlier. One of a poor donor-dependent Malthusia exposed to the vagaries of climate change, and the other an up-and-coming foreign investment hotspot with a newly minted developing status. The child kidnapper may very well be a figuration of the sacrifice required of infrastructural development and the demands of a populist regime that left little room for anything beyond a collective self-congratulatory ethos. Clearly, the bridge rumors constitute what some anthropologists have described as a hearsay public. The bourgeois public of newspaper op-eds and the hearsay public articulate themselves according to different logics of representation, circulation, evidence, and authority. The hearsay public doesn't rely on broadcast communication or the circulation of text artifacts. It's not done, their communication does not happen in the modality of agonistic exchange of opinion in the production of rational consensus. So lest these incidents are seen as evidence of the backwardness of the Bangladeshi people, which educated Bangladeshis have themselves done in the opinion pages of national dailies, let us turn to another domain where hearsay occupies an important location, that is law. I now focus on the corruption case that the World Bank filed against 3 employees of SNC Lavalin, the Canadian company that was supposed to build the bridge. The 3 people were Muhammad Ismail, the Bangladeshi Canadian citizen, Ramesh Shah, and Kevin Wallace, all employees of the company. All 3 were authorized to initial, sign, and submit documents related to the construction proposal. In World Bank Group versus Wallace, the verdict of the Supreme Court of Canada, which could not prove corruption, however, opened with a striking passage. I quote, "Corruption is a significant obstacle to international development. Corruption often transcends borders. When international financial organizations such as the World Bank Group share information gathered from informants across the world with the law enforcement agencies of member states, they help achieve what neither could do on their own," end of quote. The decision recognized that the World Bank, along with other multilateral development banks through their investigations, serves at the front line of international anti-corruption efforts. In the official letter that the World Bank issued announcing its withdrawal from the Podda Bridge project, it did not mince words. I quote, "The World Bank cannot, should not, and will not turn a blind eye to evidence of corruption." Despite losing the criminal case due to the nature of evidence, it managed to get a verdict that upheld its status as an international organization that enjoyed immunity against the compulsory submission of documents in criminal cases. The World Bank Group versus Wallace is an unusual case in which persons charged with corruption of foreign public officials applied to a Canadian court for the production of documents in possession of an international organization. The decision is significant for 2 main reasons. First, the case discusses the privileges and immunities of international organizations against compulsory production of documents in criminal cases. And second, the court followed its previous jurisprudence on challenges to wiretap authorizations and production of documents by third parties. In analyzing the case, a legal economist has pointed out how the case alleging corruption of SNC Lavalin employees by the World Bank and investigated by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police was all hearsay. Now, what is hearsay? In US law, hearsay means a statement that A, the declarant does not make while testifying at the current trial or hearing, and B, a party offers in evidence to prove the truth of the matter asserted in the statement. While no one advocates excluding all hearsay, admissibility is determined by weighing the probative force of the evidence against the possibility of prejudice, waste of time, and the availability of more satisfactory evidence. To begin with, the World Bank itself had heard of the corruption through rumors. In March 2011, an office with the RCMP, Royal Canadian Mounted Police, was approached by the World Bank concerning allegations that had come to its attention regarding possible corruption involving SNC Lavalin. The information was provided by 4 tipsters, and I'm not making this up. It reads like a spy novel, but just bear with me a little bit. There are many tipsters in this story. The details of this are intriguing, but also somewhat confusing. As the identity of tipster number 1 was unknown, it was unclear whether this was a different individual from tipster numbers 2, 3, and 4. The material supplied by tipster number 1 referred to as rumor. The World Bank followed up and asked more questions over email, which were unanswered. Tipster number 2 acknowledged his own involvement in the corruption, so his honesty was open to question. He also supplied information that others had told him, hence hearsay. The identity of tipster number 3 was unknown, and he had sent only a single email to World Bank, which was based on rumor and supposition. He starts his statement by saying, "It is known to all that the technical evaluations are manipulated by the evaluation committee." That was the email. During the hearing, the judge noted that these were nothing but a recitation of publicly known information. It confirmed little more than the fact that the tipsters had access to the internet. The RCMP did not undertake any independent investigation of any of the allegations made. They did not speak with any of the persons who were identified by the tipsters. Neither did they speak directly with either tipster number 1 or 3. The problem of wiretap as evidence also afflicted the case in a number of ways. The rumor deal was supposedly made in Dubai, though no evidence of Kevin Wallace's trip to Dubai was found. Judge Nordheimer pointed this out, I quote, "Nothing that could fairly be referred to as direct factual evidence to support the rumor and speculation was provided or investigated." Speaking of the false claim about Wallace's itinerary, he added, "The only reason for including this travel information was to lead the reader to draw the inference that Wallace was, in fact, in Dubai. This is precisely the type of language the Supreme Court of Canada derided. That is, language that tricks the reader into believing something, the truth of which is in fact unknown." This is George Nordheimer. In other words, rumor. The verdict was a big political win for Sheikh Hasina. It was pitched as evidence that there was no corruption, which her government has been saying all along. The details of the case, the inadmissibility of the evidence, and so forth were obviously ignored in this fiery political rhetoric. Later, in an interview with Canadian Broadcasting, Hasina denied any strained relationship between Bangladesh and the World Bank, pointing out that the World Bank was still offering funds for other mega projects in Bangladesh, and thereby suggesting that the corporate sovereign interdependency was very much left intact. What is relevant for our purposes today is to understand how hearsay, in the form of rumor and inadmissible evidence in court, at once challenged and bolstered the official claims around the bridge. And I wanted to show a photograph. This was celebrating the 50th year of Bangladesh World Bank collaboration, and Sheikh Hasina actually presented the World Bank president with a photograph of the bridge. So I hope the examples so far have driven the need to think about infrastructure, not simply in terms of their concreteness or spectacular nature, but the narratives that revolve around them, present them to the world, and make them legible to people who fund them, use them, or see them from afar. As Henry Ivry argues, infrastructures are not just technical systems. They're also aesthetics and cultural ones that produce very specific articulations of modernity. Infrastructure is not structure. A bridge may look like a static monolith, but it requires continual reproduction by everyone, from the commuters driving on it to the politicians who make the case for funding its maintenance. The spectacular quality of any infrastructure, however, is a complex phenomenon that relies fundamentally on linguistic circulation. Visibility as a populist tactic is not simply a political strategy. It remains a dominant motive in critical studies of infrastructure. So my argument departs from what some scholars have identified as the visibility thesis in approaching infrastructure. Despite anthropology's insistence on attending to the ordinariness of infrastructure and its call to rethink infrastructure as concrete semiotic and aesthetic vehicles oriented to addressees, and this is Brian Larkin, language is rarely the analytical focus. Even though the visual and the linguistic work in tandem, the linguistic politics of infrastructure, I submit, work differently from a visual one. So we would do well to shift our focus on reading infrastructure instead. The legibility thesis dislodges the primacy of visuality and trains us to assess the social and political production of infrastructural space. This requires imaginative investigation beyond the visible, or what Jennifer Wenzel calls infrastructure's figural dimensions, i.e., its capacity to surpass its referential message as concrete fact, while remaining attentive to its materiality. The events around the Podda Bridge guide our attention to these figural dimensions, mediated as they are through rumor and hearsay. So to conclude, what do we gain by focusing on language events to understand mega development? Here I again draw from Robert Schiller, who argues that contagious narratives often function as metaphors. They suggest some idea, mechanism, or purpose not even mentioned in the story, and the story becomes, in effect, a name for it. The Podda Bridge phenomenon is a forceful reminder that the developmental conception of the globe, a powerful narrative itself, continues to exert a moral authority, even though the language and practice of popular politics routinely punctuate the time of development. In the Podda Bridge scandal, rumor is one such form of mediation, but it's also more than that. In the set of events which I described here, it is an object of analysis, a call for action, and a dominant motive that implots a narrative of the contemporary world order in powerful hierarchical labels, like the corruption of third world regimes and the backwardness of their people. The stories around infrastructure then need to be embedded in a broader discussion of developmental democracy. To chart the global careers of both democracy and development, then, we must pay attention to the stories that circulate about them as much in the world of legal discourse as in everyday speech. Okay. Yes.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating.
Could you please introduce yourself?
Patrick, question. I'm a PhD student in political science and peace studies. I had a question about the social coalitions that may be supporting or resisting the construction of these mega projects. Not necessarily this one in particular, but you describe, I guess, are there coalitions forming around these projects or not?
Yeah, thank you. You know, mega development or development in terms of, infrastructure is also something, and this is why the visual and the linguistic, I feel like, are so interconnected, because they're also really affective spaces, right? So as I said before, there are these kinds of, I don't know if you can read the rumors as resistance, but if you do, there are people who are circulating these rumors about the bridge. They were also, completely fetishizing the bridge, right? I have a, treasure trove of songs and performances that people did on the bridge when, the week it was opening and all that, right? So people's affective relationship to these things is something that is often kind of contradictory. So people can sustain contradictory attachments to things. I think the coalitions that have been against certain kinds of, mega development were mostly environmental groups. So, for example, the most kind of vibrant political movement happened around one of the power plants that I mentioned, which is near the Sundarbans, which is the largest mangrove forest in the world, and it's actually extremely critical for kind of protecting Bangladesh from tsunami. So the mangrove and the power plant is actually in collaboration with India, and because the previous regime was so pro-India, despite a lot of these political protests against it, and in fact the mangrove is a World Heritage Site, so there was international pressure also against building that power plant, but the regime went ahead anyways. So the coalitions against this kind of mega development are mostly organized by environmental groups. But there aren't really any, these are obviously formed by citizens, conscious citizens, but there aren't kind of larger, very powerful coalitions against the idea of development. No, development is still a good word in many ways. The way it's done, there may be kind of local resistances, for example, in terms of, let's say, compensation for land, right? Those things, but kind of in a broad sense, development still carries it has a lot of purchase. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Nusrat, Yuan, and I'm a fellow here at Kellogg and a political scientist. Thank you, Nusrat. I'm a huge fan of your work, and of course, you always deliver. I have two sets of comments or questions. The first question is on the project as a whole, but bearing in mind that I haven't read the full project. So I think my first question, and it relates to my comment on because how these spaces, the state-led reforms and mega projects, they are of course spaces to enhance the regime image and build its legitimacy, but also how within these state-led reforms and spaces, how they create a space for dissent and they create a space for mobilization against the regime, right? Maybe because it puts on the table more grievances, maybe because it brings people together who now have shared grievances because of the effect of these mega projects. So my question to you would be, would the project goes into looking at these spaces, not just as spaces for increasing the regime's legitimacy or helps the regime, but also it does help opponents and opposition against the regime. So mobilize dissent against the regime. My second question is on the chapter on rumor, which is it's fascinating and how you tell the different stories and the different. You're a great storyteller, honestly, and I loved it. I was wondering, what are the functions of rumors? And I think as you were talking about the rumors, I was thinking of political satire in autocratic context. So are we like is there a political story here for the rumors? And I know you answered in your answer to the first question, you did mention that it was not this was not like this was not a tool for resistance, right? Was there anything there where maybe some groups started it because you cannot explicitly express your opposition to the project. So maybe you are delivering this opposition in a form of rumors. So there's this side of it. Was there any political story there in when we're looking at the function of rumors? But another side of the political story is how the regime responded to the violence that was created by rumors. Did it help actually increase the legitimacy of the regime? And look what these people are doing. Because I was just reading before I came to your lecture a piece by my colleague. It's on the case of Algeria, but he was talking about how violence is good news for autocracies, right? Because it does legitimize the use of violence against people. So are we looking like maybe there's a story here about how these rumors helped the regime actually, not only threatened it. But again, thank you so much for fascinating work as always.
Thank you. Let me start with the second one. I mean, when I say that I don't want to read them as resistance, because I think there is kind of a tendency to simplify, events like this, and it's tempting to read them as kind of a direct resistance to the idea of a certain kind of development. But that's not saying that there isn't something that is about dissent, right? Obviously, I mean, it is. So let's say the people who were, most people who were subscribing to the rumors and these kinds of, mob violence were happening near the bridge, near the area where people were displaced. That would actually make a kind of more direct connection, right? Between, these are people who are actually, dislocated from their ancestral land, which is often happens, the kind of sacrifice that is needed, for development to thrive. But the kind of circulation and the circuit of movement of these rumors was very different, right? People very far from the bridge who have never even been close to the river were, acting on the basis of these rumors. So at one level, yes, and I do say that the child kidnapper becomes kind of a figuration of, the sacrifices of development, right? But to call them resistance in this way, I think simplifies the story, and it makes it seem legible in a way that I don't think it is. At least I don't think we really have the kind of tools to really understand what's going on there. At the same time, there is an element of dissent, obviously, because you're not subscribing to the official narrative of development, right? At the same time, this kind of structure of rumor, and which I didn't know before I started doing research on this, and it's not just, specific to South Asia, it has a very concrete, very kind of recursive structure. So in various parts in Southeast Asia, in Latin America, in parts of Africa, you see similar rumors being mobilized about different kinds of mega projects, right? And there's always something that needs to be sacrificed. And it's interesting that it's often either a child or a woman, right? So what happens is that this kind of, maybe we can think of them as germs, G-E-R-M, germs of some kind of dissent that then get tagged onto a structure that is already familiar, a narrative structure, right? So those scripts are already available to people. So a concern about something that is happening now then gets articulated through a structure that is familiar or a script that is familiar. But again, I mean, I think my interest here is that not, the problem with analyzing something like this is always the danger of falling into the trope of, look how backward these people are, right? But that narrative, it's itself mobilized by the state, by the regime, by these op-ed writers, right? Like, and it is, what happened is horrific. But at the same time, a lot of horrific things happen in the name of development, as we all know, right? So I think it's, in some ways, it did help the regime, but I also think that it also kind of baffled them, right? Because there were multiple people who were being killed, and just saying that, oh, these are just, conspiracies, these are schemes, people are just trying to tarnish the image of the regime, didn't work, because rumor is a very powerful medium of communication, as we all know. So it, I think more than the regime, it kind of offended the sensibilities of an which is kind of the more vocal group of people, right, in a place like this. And to come back to the project as a whole, I think this will also depend a lot about what I do in the fieldwork in the next few months, right? But, broadly speaking, the first book is about the crowd and really looking at, what people are doing on the ground. And it was all about dissent. It was all about resistance, because I started doing fieldwork among a group of people who were being dislocated because of, a mining project. This particular project, I wanted to focus on the mob, which I describe as a fugitive political formation, because mobs are ephemeral and mobs are very difficult to define. But at the same time, I also wanted to talk about how the kind of discourse of, I mean, of course, rumor is a form of dissent, or dissent is often articulated in the form of rumor, because it's always dismissed as a kind of legitimate form of communication. But I think in this project, at least at the outset, I'm not necessarily looking at spaces of resistance per se. I kind of wanted to look at more how language is mobilized to talk about infrastructure in a way that actually helps shore up populist legitimacy. But again, I'm an anthropologist, so I don't know what's going to happen in the next 5 months, and this might be a completely different thing. So we'll see. Thank you. Please go ahead.
Yes. Enjoyed your presentation, and I really appreciate how you try to connect the linguistic with the visual here. I'm curious about the, so my understanding is the linguistic kind of structures how we understand the visual here. Have you also seen examples the other way around, like visual, especially visual technologies we have? I heard you speak about social media. How it impacts linguistic structures. Can you expand on that?
Yeah.
And also maybe particularly the gender aspects of structures, which itself may be constituted by gendered ideologies or not?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And this is something I struggle with also because, I mean, this is mega development. It's supposed to be spectacular. I mean, visibility is really at the heart of it, right? But I think my argument is that you miss a lot if you don't actually also take into account how that visibility is also created through language, right? And how I came to this is actually through the category of the mob. Because, I worked on the crowd, I still work on the crowd, and there's a lot of kind of discussion about the mob as being, or even the crowd, as being affective, as being, corporeal, and being pre-linguistic to a certain extent, right? When you are participating in mob violence, you are not thinking, you're acting. And I think that actually is deeply limiting. Because, and in the longer version where I talk about the particular case of, Renu's death, there's a lot of talk that's happening. And the first one is the actual naming of the person as a child kidnapper, right? The naming has to happen first, the recognition that this is a child kidnapper, which is all happening through language. And I also elaborate on the fact that she is covered, right? So her face or kind of ways of identifying her or not being able to identify her were actually not the main issues here. The issue was that she couldn't really articulate, who she was in a way that kind of started these suspicions. And there was a lot of, lot of things happened through language that actually made the violence possible. So I'm not ignoring that the fact that the images of her, being beaten up were circulating on social media, and that is, a very common thing that happens now in various parts of the world. In India, you see violence against, the caste violence is often recorded and they circulate through WhatsApp and whatnot for various political reasons. So I think I came to this by being dissatisfied with that framework, that if we just focus on visibility, then we lose a lot. We actually don't know what is happening in the interaction, which is not just affective and bodily. There's a lot of talk that also happens there. The gender question is interesting. I think the reason why this particular case was created such a stir is precisely because she was a woman. And people who were involved in kind of making her the child kidnapper were also women, which is a little, which is not very common. I mean, vigilante violence, beating up petty thieves, pickpockets, it's unfortunately relatively common in this part of the world. But they're mostly working class men, doing violence against working class men. So the fact that this was a woman and other women were involved is something that made it unusual. Whether that says something about gender and the mob, I'm not sure yet. But it's an interesting thing to keep in mind. Thank you.
Thank you, Nusrat. Juan Chamorro, visiting fellow. Very fascinating aspect of infrastructure projects. I'm learning a lot. I would like to touch a completely different topic coming from politics, and that is, mega projects are usually the preferred option for governments to try to gain legitimacy, public support, national identity, unifying the country, and such that, and it's very common. I mean,
Yeah.
Especially among governments that probably are in the need of getting that.
Yeah.
So, so I'm wondering, which is ironic that the government was out of power precisely when the bridge was being finalized. So I'm wondering if the bridge actually played a counter effect to the feeling of the national among groups like students, that they saw the bridge as a symbol of extravaganza or something that was not attached to their actual needs. So I would like you to. I know it's not the main.
No, but it's a very relevant aspect of it. Whether it actually had the unintended kind of consequence of people really thinking that, okay, the bigger the projects, the more the corruption, which is actually true, right? But what was happening? I think it's definitely there. I don't know how consciously, but when I was talking about, in my other talk about what's happening in Bangladesh, one of the things that happened at the height of the protests was that these metro rail stations were attacked, right? And they were vandalized. And that generated one of the most, one of the funniest and most powerful memes of this political movement, that Sheikh Hasina went to one of the metro rail stations that was vandalized and she cried. And by that time, more than 100 students were killed. And she didn't acknowledge them, she didn't mourn them, but she cried looking at, the vandalism at the metro rail station. And that just created this like huge uproar. And two very contradictory discourses came out. One was that she only cares about her mega projects, right? Her signature projects, and she doesn't care about the people of her country. At the same time, people were also saying that she's acting. She should have received an Oscar, like things like that, right? So, but they were simultaneously saying two different things. That at one level, she totally means it. She doesn't feel anything for the people. And at the same time, she's not meaning anything at all. She's just like acting, right? But the fact that the metro rail station was attacked is something that was striking, and people pointed that out, because the metro rail, despite all its problems, has been, helpful to people, has been able to mitigate the traffic problem a little bit, but at the same time, it got attached to the government, right? In a way that these are the ways in which corruption happened. But we also have to understand that a lot of the information about corruption that's coming out now was people were aware of them instinctively, but this was a place where you couldn't talk about them. As I said, I was talking to the journalist, and even though he didn't share anything with me, the fact that they wrote a couple of articles in the newspaper questioning why the bridge was taking so long, that they were already kind of branded, right? So this was a place where people really couldn't offer any critique of the kind of corruption that these mega projects entailed, but they have kind of an instinctive understanding of the corruption. And I think it comes back to what Narmin was saying about having a language to actually articulate your grievances, right? And this is also one of my arguments. And that's when you actually resort to things like rumors, because rumors don't have any particular authorship, right? So you can actually articulate grievances through these informal channels of communication when other avenues are not available to you. But that's a good point. Thank you. Hey.
Hi, my name is Sandra Otero. I'm a fellow here at the Kellogg. I have a question, and this may not be something that you look at in your project, but if you think it makes sense, I would like to hear you talk about it. It seems to me, or at least in discussions around infrastructure, that either visually or language, in the terms of the discourse that is built around them, this can operate in different levels. At the local level, at the site level, at the regional, the national, in terms of the construction of legitimacy, a national story, and then in other levels, for example, at the international level, in dealing with these institutions. And you showed us a couple of pictures that we referenced. So I'm wondering if these levels are something that you are interested in. And if not, if you could simply comment a little bit on whether the stories around corruption, but then the others, and you say you have this treasure trove of other like different narratives or positive ones. How do they operate at the different levels in terms of the building of the legitimacy?
I'm very much interested. And I think actually focusing on language helps me do that. Right. And the thing that I wanted to get more into is the particular court case, right? And I'm still trying to, get people to talk to me. But I have some interviews lined up in Washington, DC, the people who are going to talk to me. Now everybody wants to talk. See, now a window has opened up, right? People are not scared. They can't say, oh, I can't talk to you because I need to go back to Bangladesh. My visa would be canceled. So I feel like, a small window has opened up when people, would actually talk to me. But I think definitely, the way discourses circulate, actually help me connect these dots, right? The local, the national, the international, because I don't think they can be separated or compartmentalized anymore in the kind of world that we live in, right? And also the World Bank case helps me to kind of not label the rumors in Bangladesh about child sacrifice and whatever as like some kind of a relic from the past, right? Because people are, people are connected in ways that I think it would be a mistake in our part to think that, oh, this is what uneducated people do, and this is what, I mean, look at the World Bank case. I mean, everything that was submitted as evidence was rumor, and the judge said, and anybody with access to the internet could come up with these claims, right? But at the same time, that verdict, it wasn't a verdict saying there was no corruption. It was a verdict saying this evidence is not admissible, right? But that was used as something to kind of bolster the rhetoric of the government that, see, the Supreme Court of Canada dismissed this case, which has nothing to do with the actual, like, what happened there, right? So I feel like, language or, linguistic communication helps me connect this, or helps me articulate these connections that already exist. But we can talk more about this. And then Kelly.
Thanks for the presentation. This project is super interesting.
Thank you.
I was curious about the idea of sacrifice.
Yeah.
That came up in different ways
Yeah.
in the presentation. So clearly the process of development is highly connected with sacrifice in many ways.
Yeah.
We know the human cost of development projects. We talk about sacrificial zones in ecological terms.
Yeah.
But as I was listening to you, I wonder if what sacrifice means in the context of development is different from the way we normally think about this concept, in the sense that it seems to me we normally think about sacrifice as the cost that we, the community, collectively pay for accessing the sacred, let's say. But in the context you tell the story, right, say about the children and so on, the story is quite different. Sacrifice is kind of the unnecessary cost that we're paying for development. It's parallel to corruption, right? It's a necessary cost we're paying for development. So it seems to me that there is a story of sacrifice, and it's very different from the way
kind of sacrifice.
we think sacrifice in normal contexts.
Yeah, that's a great point. So sacrifice is something that I have been thinking about, but I go back and forth. There are days when I feel like sacrifice is the main issue here, and then there are days that are like, no, I think it's the wrong direction. But I think one of the things that I will really need to engage with is the literature on developmental democracy, which is about a particular understanding of sacrifice, right? Sacrifice in the need of, for the sake of development. Whereas, as you've pointed out, the sacrifice needed in the kind of that are pointed out in the rumors is a different kind of unnecessary or extraneous or something excessive, I guess is the word I'm looking for. Is kind of an excessive form of violence that is needed for the sake of development. But perhaps they're kind of both related. And I'm thinking about this as I'm speaking, that maybe they're not opposites or separate. They're actually one way of articulating a resistance to that other concept of sacrifice, which is like, you sacrifice for the nation, right? It's kind of a given. I mean, Benedict Anderson's first line in Imagine Communities, right? Like, why do we take it for granted that we'll sacrifice our lives for a nation? Why is it, so normalized, right? So that kind of sacrifice that has been normalized is actually kind of undone in this other articulation of sacrifice, I think. I'm not sure, but it's an interesting thing to think about. But I'm just kind of thinking about it right now. But it is important to explore at least these two concepts of sacrifice that are at work. I think they're related, but I have to figure out how. But I'll think more about it. Thank you.
Can I just throw in a thought on exactly this point of sacrifice and connecting this to your approach of language? I would see a really interesting field for investigation if you would do kind of a content analysis or discourse analysis on sacrifice in the specific context you are
I see.
exploring. So
Yeah.
I think this would be really meaningful
Yeah,
to pick up what Anibal said.
Yeah.
but bring it then into a more open question, not there's one or two
Right.
concepts of sacrifice, but look at it
I see.
inductively and
right.
really look at it like what is the framing of sacrifice
Yeah.
in this context you are exploring.
Right.
And yet then you might come up with different, very
Right.
different frames of sacrifice.
Right.
And this would be, in my view, also an interesting outcome of your work.
No, that's great. But of course, I when I'm thinking about this, I also think in Bengali, right? Because sacrifice, the word is not often used. I mean, it is used very directly when it comes to like kind of nationalist rhetoric, right? You sacrifice your life for the nation. But that word doesn't exist when it comes to, it's the, if you look at this. Sorry, I turned it off apparently. But one of the collages that I showed, right, that was circulating on the internet, the bridge wants blood was the line, right? The bridge needs blood. So the bridge in this case has an agency, and it's the one that's demanding sacrifice.
Yeah.
So that's not using the same word. For example, when you're talking about, oh, we need to give our lives for the nation. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not an important
Exactly.
avenue to explore. There are different ways of thinking about sacrifice. But that's a great point. Thank you. Kelly.
I'll just talk to you one-on-one because you probably want to end it.
And we have time for one more.
Yes, okay.
Thank you so much.
So, I'm Kelly McMahon, hello fellow. I have a comment and a question. So my comment was an idea that I think now I've convinced myself isn't worthwhile, but I'll throw it out.
Yeah,
Maybe I think it's useful. So I was thinking about the difference between the linguistic and the visual and how geography has a different impact on those.
I see.
So for language to like generate a rumor, you don't have to be anywhere near the bridge. You just need to have another human
Right.
contact with another human,
Right.
right? And for the visual, to generate something from scratch, like firsthand, you need to have access to the bridge. But then I convinced myself, maybe this doesn't even matter nowadays because even if you can't take a photo of the bridge, you can make a meme from someone else's photo. So maybe there's.
No, but it's interesting to think about presence, right? I mean, I think one of the things that made me think about also, about dissent and resistance is that the people who were the places where people were being killed were nowhere near the bridge, right? And that says something about the power of rumor itself, but also the ways in which things circulate, right? And a lot of the images that were circulating when this rumor was kind of at its peak, they were images of the bridge even before the bridge was built, right? So they were kind of speculative images of that the bridge was already done, but the bridge was not done at the time. We're talking about 2019 and the bridge opened in 2022. So I think a certain kind of visuality was necessary, but at the same time, these rumors were also circulating in areas where people, like in local markets, in front of schools, right? Where, I mean, of course, many people have access to social media, but those were not the only channels through which the rumors were circulating, which means that the visuality was part of it, but that wasn't all of it. But it's important to think about the geography of this,
And then my question, I was interested in the idea of rumor as unsubstantiated knowledge, not connected to an individual. And you said you weren't sure in this case whether these rumors should be treated as resistance. But I was wondering, in your work as a whole, is rumor an organized opposition strategy? Have you seen that? Because I usually think of an advantage of the opposition is trying to convey the truth, because often in autocracies, the government's not conveying the truth. So you can think about whether Navalny or the grandmothers in Latin America when they disappeared, they're making a real effort to convey the truth and gain legitimacy that way. But do you also see, either in this case or in your work generally on opposition, rumor being used by an organized opposition as a strategy?
Yes, not necessarily these rumors. And you know, what I said about how this regime actually branded rumor as kind of a criminal activity, right? So anything that was critical of the government was dismissed or criminalized as rumor.
Okay.
But in this particular case, because of the nature of the violence that this rumor actually spurred, nobody wanted to make claims on them. So you know, people who were even very against the regime or whatever, the voice of reason against corruption, they also wanted to distance themselves because it was really seen as kind of a class, you know, class education, you know, all those markers. So it wasn't really, you know, kind of articulated as being oppositional, you know, oppositional to the state in a way that, you know, people who are against the state would claim them for itself. Everybody wanted to distance themselves.
Thanks.
Thank you, Nusrat.
Thank
We
you
look
so
forward
much.
to reading this.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Thank you for coming.